Welcome to the Chapter 15 overview, Global Commerce 1450 to 1750. Main idea? Trade networks drove the engine of globalization during this time period and had substantial political, social, and environmental consequences. Setting the stage. This chapter begins by looking at the arrival of European maritime trade in Asian waters, China's recalling of the voyages of Zhang He, and the explorations of Vasco da Gama, both of which you learned about in Chapter 13, set the stage for Europe's position of strength. You will also look at the expanding power of the Russian Empire and its march across Siberia, and the impact of European colonization in North America. Finally, the chapter will cover the causes and effects of the transatlantic slave trade, a consequence of the social and economic changes set in motion by the Columbian Exchange. Relevance. As we move farther along in our textbook, the connections between history and our world become more direct. Here we look at the dawn of globalization, which of course is the defining characteristic of our world today. Here in the United States, we have a history of problems of race relations, a legacy of the slave trade that developed after Europeans arrived in the Americas. So the first section is called Europeans and Asian Commerce. Europeans were motivated to seek trade routes to Asia by religious, political, and economic factors, resulting in a dramatically increased European presence in Asian trade networks by the end of this time period. For centuries, Europe had lusted after the trade goods of Asia, spices, textiles, exotic jewels, and more. To the monarchs of Europe, whose empires became more prosperous after the Black Death receded in the early 14th century, current trade relationships were unacceptable. Islamic nations controlled goods coming from the Mediterranean, and cities like Venice dominated that trade anyway. Spain, Portugal, Britain, the French, and the Dutch found their own way, but were still faced with a problem: how to pay for Chinese goods in an imbalanced trade relationship. First, the Portuguese. As you know, Vasco da Gama's voyage around the tip of Africa gave the Portuguese the upper hand in the race to Asian riches. Without a presence in Asian waters, Portugal established a series of trading ports known as Trading Post Empire. On this map here, in the orange, are the trading posts in the territory controlled by the Dutch, as you can see mostly here on East Africa. Remember, the Dutch came around Africa this way, and so settled all along East Africa. And there are some trading posts here. The city of Goa in India, it's hard to see, but it is orange. And that is the Portuguese influence, mostly in this region of Asia. This empire was created by force because upon their arrival in East Africa, the Portuguese discovered that their own trade goods were vastly inferior to those circulating around the Indian Ocean network, and no one wanted them. Using their superior naval technology, the new arrivals forced others to trade with them, creating monopoly by force. Portuguese dominance lasted until around 1600, when they were pushed out by more powerful European and local states. Spain and the Philippines. Spain came to Asian waters by a different route, establishing control of the Philippines after Magellan's around-the-world voyage, which began in Spain, went around the tip of South America, across the Pacific Ocean, and then arrived in the Philippines from the east. Spanish control of the Philippines took on a different character than the Portuguese trading posts, as Spain conquered the islands and established a colonial empire there. Here are the Philippines up here, and the green on the map shows Spanish territory. This was accompanied by a major missionary effort, and the Philippines became a Christian outpost in Asia. Its location at the intersection of trade networks made it a cosmopolitan colony, with Chinese laborers in particular populating Spain's Asian colony. Now the East India Companies. Just when the Portuguese felt in control of Indian Ocean trade, the British and Dutch arrived with a new economic model that proved superior. This was a trading company formed by a charter with the home government and funded by private investors. Here is Apple's market cap here, and the most wealthy company in the history of the world is the Dutch East India Company over here on the right. In the early 17th century, sea battles abounded in the Indian Ocean, with the British, Dutch, and French fighting for supremacy of those ancient sea lanes. When the dust had settled, the British had economic control over India and the Dutch over Indonesia, known as the Dutch East Indies. So on the map, this is what we now call Indonesia. It's known as the Dutch East Indies at that time period, and the British are going to gain control of India. In each location, European control became political as well as economic, with each of these colonies producing valued goods that helped Europe gain equal trade footing and putting a halt to the silver drain, which you'll learn about in a future section. In India, crops like cotton and tea fueled the British Empire, and in Indonesia, the Dutch controlled the lucrative spice trade. It's important to remember that despite the growing presence of European traders, Asian trade was still dominated by Asian countries. The policies of Japan serve as a good illustration of this. As you know, Japan became unified by the Tokugawa shogunate in the 17th century, and this ruling class saw European traders as a threat, acting to bar them from trading in Japan. It wasn't until the 19th century that the West gained the upper hand there. You will learn more about that later. For now, be sure to include in your notes evidence that this era of increasing European control was not as one-sided as it may seem. Silver and global commerce. The silver trade united the globe economically while demonstrating the continued importance of China in the world's economic relationships. As you know, China's self-image defined it as occupying a unique and chosen place in the world. Economically, China was quite self-sufficient, and there was little demand for foreign goods. In the 1570s, China levied a tax on its citizens that had to be paid in silver, creating a massive demand for the precious metal and enacting a global trade in silver, which became the world's first global currency. In this trade, silver mines in European colonies such as Bolivia produced silver that Europe used to purchase Asian goods, which were then sold throughout the Western world for profit. As you read, keep an eye out for the global effects of this trade. If you pay close attention to the arrows in particular, which represent the direction of silver flow, you'll see that they begin in the Americas. So some of it begins here, and some of it begins down here. This is the trade in Bolivia I mentioned, and it takes a variety of routes and circulates around the world. Fur and global commerce. Climate change in the early modern era helped create a worldwide fur trade controlled by Europeans, which had significant consequences for Native American and Siberian populations. Possibly due to an era of cooling known as the Little Ice Age, during this era fur became a major global commodity. Most of the fur circulated on the global market was trapped in North America by Native Americans, shown here on this map. While there was some benefit to Native Americans who had access to European goods, the deaths from disease were very high. Over in Eurasia, fur had great importance in the Russian Empire. The lucrative fur trade was the primary motivation for the expansion of the Russian Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the trade had similar consequences for Siberians as it did for Indians in the Americas. Finally, commerce and people, the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade had profound social, political, and economic effects on both Africa and the Americas. This section begins by reminding us that slavery was an ancient practice centered around the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, and Western Africa. A tragic product of the Columbian Exchange was the development of a massive transatlantic slave trade. As you can see from the chart, sugar was the major impetus for this trade. Think back to your work for Chapter 14 to connect sugar production to these regions. Initially, Slavic-speaking people from the Eastern Mediterranean region were the main source of slaves. The word Slav is the basis for the word slavery. After the Ottoman seizure of Constantinople, European colonizers considered Native Americans as a labor source, but their invulnerability to disease eliminated that option. The Portuguese exploration of Western Africa was the final factor that established this transatlantic trade, linking West Africa and the Americas. The slave trade in practice. Generally, slaves were sold to Europeans by African elites, who continued the ancient practice of selling captured prisoners of war into slavery. While some societies profited from the trade, others were devastated. For the slaves themselves, of course, the slave passage was brutal, inhumane, and impossible to imagine. A central part of the slave trade was the dehumanizing of the slaves themselves, with horrifying consequences. For African states, the slave trade resulted in political and economic destabilization. At a time when states around the world experienced economic growth, there was no foreign investment in West African states, and thus no growth. As you can see from this map, Europe lacked knowledge of Africa and relied on local states to facilitate the slave trade. Some states, like Benin, attempted to resist the slave trade, while others, like Dahomey, decided to participate more willingly. In the end, neither approach ended well for Africa. During this era, Western Africa fell victim to political and economic forces beyond its control, with devastating results. Now the 10-second spice review. Slavery continued to define social hierarchies, and European political rivalries drove economic expansion. Climate and disease affected trade patterns between continents, and the spread of Christianity was a cultural effect of the increasing globalization of trade networks during the modern era. For the visual summary, we begin with the Portuguese arriving in Asia, the reaction of Europe, Spain, and the Philippines, and the Dutch and British East India companies, contributing to a global commerce. And the main commodities that were traded at this time were spices from the Indies, fur from North America and Russia, and slaves from West Africa. And one of the chief currencies that is used to pay for all this, of course, is silver. That's your Chapter 15 overview. Happy reading!
Money!